The emergency convocation of the Galactic Council had not been called in nearly 300 cycles, and the mere activation of the Crimson Chamber lights was enough to send ripples of unease through 17 star systems. Representatives from across known space filled the amphitheater, scaled, furred, crystalline, multi-limbed, gas-contained, each species seated within environmental fields calibrated precisely to their biological needs. Above them, a holographic projection rotated slowly in the center of the chamber, a blue planet wrapped in white cloud systems, oceans glinting under the light of a modest yellow star. The designation hovered beside it in clean council script, SOL 3. Local name, Earth. Classification pending. For several long seconds, no one spoke. They were not staring at the oceans or the continents. They were staring at a single line of data beneath the planetary mass index. Surface gravity, 1.0 standard. A murmur spread through the chamber like a pressure wave. Several delegates immediately accessed archive protocols, cross-referencing the number as if it might change under scrutiny. It did not. The Chancellor, an elderly Karthik with 4 trembling eye clusters, adjusted the amplification field around her podium. "Confirm the measurement," she ordered. The data analysts complied. Orbital probes, remote mass density calculations, spectrographic core modeling. Each independent verification returned the same result. 1 standard gravity, a threshold that had not appeared in a viable planetary report since the Great Abandonments. The last time such a number had been recorded in Council archives, 3 exploratory species had attempted settlement. Within 2 cycles, skeletal collapse, organ strain, and catastrophic reproductive failure had nearly driven them to extinction. The official ruling afterward had been unanimous. Worlds at or above 1G were to be classified as biologically prohibitive. No colonization, no habitation, no exceptions. And yet, the Chancellor said slowly, this species claims not only habitation, but full civilizational development. Her gaze shifted toward the single new figure present in the chamber's diplomatic circle. The human stood alone within a neutral environment field calibrated to match Earth's atmospheric pressure. He wore dark formal garments, his posture upright, hands loosely clasped behind his back as if the weight of the chamber's silence pressed no heavier upon him than ordinary air. His species profile floated beside him in the display, Homo sapiens. Population, approximately 8 billion. Technological status, FTL capable. Gravity of origin, 1.0 standard. Ambassador Hayes, the Chancellor addressed him, voice echoing faintly against the vaulted alloy walls. Do you confirm the accuracy of your planet's gravitational measurement? The human inclined his head once. Yes, Chancellor. Earth's surface gravity averages 9.8 meters per second squared. We refer to it simply as normal. A ripple of discomfort moved across several delegations. The Velcrin representative adjusted his support harness reflexively, as if feeling phantom compression along his spine. The Brenti delegate's secondary heart rate spiked audibly within her environmental pod. Normal. The word carried an unsettling casualness. A xenobiology advisor activated a private channel to the Chancellor, but forgot to mute the chamber feed. This must be a misinterpretation, she insisted. Perhaps their calibration differs. Perhaps they evolved under artificial enhancement. The human's head tilted slightly. We evolved naturally, he clarified, voice steady. No genetic reinforcement, no structural modification prior to our industrial era. 1 gravity is what shaped us. That statement carried more weight than the number itself. Shaped us. Several species in the chamber had required exoskeletal reinforcement to endure even 0.8 standard gravities for extended research rotations. The idea of a civilization forming cities, agriculture, and orbital infrastructure under 1G conditions bordered on absurdity. The Chancellor steadied herself. You understand, Ambassador, that 1G worlds are categorized as evolutionary dead zones. The metabolic expenditure alone exceeds survivability thresholds for most sentient life. Hayes gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. With respect, Chancellor, perhaps survivability thresholds depend on where you start. The chamber went utterly still. It was not defiance in his tone. It was not arrogance. It was something far more destabilizing, certainty. He was not arguing that humans had conquered gravity. He was implying that gravity had built them. An archivist projected a historical recording into the air, fractured footage from the failed Kirill expedition 4 millennia prior. Colonists struggling to stand. Structural frames buckling. Medical reports citing bone density degradation and cardiac overload. The memory had become doctrine. One gravity crushed civilizations before they could root. And yet this human stood without visible strain, lungs expanding and contracting at a calm rhythm, heart beating steadily against an environment that would have been lethal to most in the chamber. 8 billion, a delegate whispered, disbelief saturating the word. The human nodded. Approximately. And growing. The data projection shifted again, revealing urban centers glittering across continents, orbital satellites encircling the planet, a lunar outpost already operational. Infrastructure. Industry. Culture. Not survival. Flourishing. The Chancellor felt the axis of established science tilt beneath her. If this was true, if one gravity was not an absolute biological wall, then thousands of quarantined systems across the galaxy had been mislabeled for millennia. Entire star charts marked with red prohibition symbols might, under human physiology, be perfectly habitable. The implications spread outward like a shockwave. For the record, the Chancellor said carefully, does your species experience constant physiological distress under 1G conditions? Hayes considered the question as if genuinely puzzled. No, Chancellor. We jog under it. We build skyscrapers under it. Some of us climb mountains for recreation. The word recreation struck the chamber harder than any statistic. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. The idea of voluntarily ascending additional vertical mass under 1G strain bordered on pathological. The holographic Earth continued its slow rotation overhead, serene and impossibly stable. The Council had once believed gravity above 0.9 standard was nature's final warning sign, a boundary not to be crossed. Now a species stood before them that had not merely crossed it, but called it home. Silence reclaimed the chamber, heavy and uncertain. For the first time since the Great Abandonments, the number 1.0 no longer represented impossibility. It represented humanity, and the realization settling over the Galactic Council was far more destabilizing than gravity itself. The Council did not adjourn after the first session, it escalated. Within hours, a joint resolution passed to initiate immediate xenobiological verification procedures under full diplomatic transparency. If humanity truly evolved under one standard gravity, then every foundational model of galactic evolutionary limitation required revision. And if they were exaggerating, or worse, manipulating data, then the implications were equally grave. Ambassador Hayes agreed to testing without hesitation. You'll find we're consistent, he said calmly as Council technicians prepared the adaptive analysis chamber. That confidence unsettled them more than defiance would have. The testing facility was constructed to accommodate extremes. High-pressure simulations for dense atmosphere species, thermal fluctuation chambers for plasma-adapted life forms, and gravitic modulation fields capable of precise incremental shifts. Most species experienced visible strain at 0.8 G. The Brenti required supportive harnessing beyond 0.7. Even the relatively resilient Krytoians avoided prolonged exposure above 0.9 without structural reinforcement. The chamber now calibrated itself to Earth's reported baseline, 1.0 standard. The field activated with a low harmonic hum. Ambassador Hayes stepped inside. Observers leaned forward in their containment pods. Bioscanners began mapping skeletal load distribution, muscular microcontractions, vascular pressure response, and neural stress indicators. The field stabilized. One gravity pressed downward in perfect simulation. Hayes adjusted his cuffs. Feels about right, he said. The first silence lasted 12 seconds. Heart rate within optimal range, one analyst reported, voice tight. Respiratory output stable. No cortisol spike. No structural microfracturing. A Velcrin xenophysiologist leaned closer to her display. Increase to 1.05, she ordered quietly. The gravitic hum deepened. In most species, a 5% increase above tolerance thresholds produced immediate fatigue tremors or cardiovascular strain. Hayes rolled his shoulders experimentally. This is a bit heavier than home, he commented, like carrying a loaded backpack. His muscle fibers registered increased activation, but well within safe margins. Increased to 1.1, another voice whispered. The chancellor hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding. The field intensified. 1.1 standard gravity had historically marked the onset of organ stress collapse in failed colonization attempts. The monitoring screens filled with data streams. Hayes shifted his stance slightly to redistribute balance, then bent down and touched his palms to the chamber floor. With controlled ease, he performed a push-up, then another, and another. His heart rate elevated, but proportionally, predictably, like a being engaged in exercise, not survival. That is not possible, breathed Professor Kareth of the Xenobiology Consortium. Bone density scan, she demanded. The results populated instantly. Human cortical bone density exceeded council median averages by 3.2 times. Microstructure analysis revealed compact lattice reinforcement optimized for vertical load bearing. Their skeletons evolved to resist continuous compression, she said, almost to herself. Not occasional. Continuous. Musculature analysis, the chancellor pressed. High tensile fiber ratio. Adaptive hypertrophy potential. Exceptional microtier recovery metrics. Their muscle groups are overbuilt for baseline activity. A Brenti medic swallowed audibly. They are carrying structural redundancies most species only develop under stress conditioning. The gravitic field stabilized at 1.1 G for a full 5 minutes. Hayes stopped exercising and stood upright again, breathing deeper now, but not distressed. You planning to push it higher? He asked mildly. A murmur rippled through the observation deck. The idea that he could endure more unsettled them in ways they struggled to articulate. Return to baseline. The chancellor ordered at last. When the field lowered back to 1G and then gradually to council standard 0.6, something unexpected occurred. Hayes visibly relaxed. His shoulders eased. He rolled his neck with a faint smile. This feels like vacation, he said. The analysts froze. Rerun muscular output tests at 0.6. Professor Kareth insisted. The chamber recalibrated. Weighted resistance modules deployed automatically. Hayes gripped the handle of a calibrated mass bar designed to test upper limit strain tolerance for council species. At 0.6 G, the effective load was well within Velcrin athletic range. Hayes lifted it once, twice. Then, noticing the analyst's expressions, he added more mass plates. The servos recalculated effective weight under reduced gravity. He lifted again. Stop, one technician whispered. He did not strain the way council athletes did under competition load. His musculature activated efficiently, smoothly. When he set the bar down, the metal base emitted a hollow reverberation across the chamber floor. Effective lift under 0.6 G, equivalent to over 300 standard units. Professor Kareth announced, voice hollow. That exceeds council-heavy labor thresholds. And this is an average human? The chancellor asked quietly. Hayes wiped his palms on his trousers. I go to the gym a few times a week, he admitted. But I'm not military. Not elite. The implications settled over the chamber like a gravitational well of its own. If this individual represented baseline civilian capacity, then humanity's upper physical limits existed far beyond the data currently recorded. And more unsettling still, in most council standard environments, humans were operating below their evolutionary load. Cardiovascular stress test, another analyst said, almost reflexively. A treadmill module extended from the chamber floor. At 1G, Hayes jogged. His oxygen consumption increased proportionally, but remained within healthy parameters. At 1.1G, he continued. Sweat formed along his brow, but his heart rhythm remained stable. No arrhythmia. No organ failure markers. No panic-induced adrenal spikes. They evolved endurance under continuous gravitational resistance, Professor Kareth whispered. Their entire metabolic architecture is designed for sustained load. And under lower gravity, the chancellor asked. The treadmill recalibrated to 0.6 G. Hayes accelerated effortlessly. What had been a jog became something closer to bounding strides. His vertical displacement increased. His reaction times, measured through neural response tests, shortened measurably. Reflex enhancement under reduced gravitational strain, an analyst reported in disbelief. They become faster. The chamber powered down at last. When Hayes stepped out, there was no applause. No outcry. Only stunned quiet. The scientific impossibility had not collapsed under scrutiny. It had solidified. Professor Kareth turned slowly toward the Chancellor. "We have misclassified 1G worlds," she said. "No." The Chancellor replied softly, watching the human accept a glass of water from an attendant and thank them with polite composure. "We have misclassified humans." And in that distinction lay the beginning of a far more profound realization. Gravity had not limited life. It had selected for it. And somewhere in the distant spiral arm of the Sol system, evolution had chosen a species that did not merely endure one standard gravity. It thrived in it. The demonstration in the testing chamber might have remained a controlled scientific revelation if not for what happened 3 days later on Trade Station Heliox 9. The station orbited a minor gas giant at the edge of Council space and operated at a comfortable 0.35 standard gravity to accommodate the majority of member species. It was not politically significant. It was not militarily fortified. It was simply busy, cargo shipments, diplomatic exchanges, and civilian transport moving through its docks in steady cycles. Humans had only recently been granted limited transit access, and a small contingent of Earth engineers were present to finalize trade agreements involving high-density construction materials. No one expected history to pivot inside Docking Ring C. The accident began with a routine equipment failure. A magnetic cargo clamp disengaged during transfer, releasing a sealed container mid-rotation. The crate's listed mass was 400 kilograms. Under 0.35 g, its effective weight was reduced, but its mass remained unchanged. It drifted for less than half a second before inertial vectors carried it toward the edge of the docking corridor where 3 Velcrin technicians were guiding another shipment. The velocity indicator spiked red. At that speed, the container would not fall. It would collide, momentum translating into catastrophic impact. Velcrin skeletal structures were not built to absorb such force. Neither were the corridor's pressure seals. Security footage later showed the moment with terrible clarity. A warning klaxon sounded. One Velcrin attempted to activate a repulsion field, but misjudged the timing. Another froze. The container rotated mid-air, metal surface glinting under station lights, trajectory locked. Then someone moved. Human dock engineer Marcus Ibarra had been 20 meters away, reviewing a manifest. He dropped his tablet before the second alarm tone finished sounding. Witnesses later struggled to describe what they saw because their visual processing struggled to track it. Under 0.35 g, human stride length expanded dramatically. Marcus covered the distance in bounding arcs, each footfall propelling him farther than any Velcrin athlete could have managed. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He launched himself toward the container. Impact. The crate struck him midair. The sound echoed through the docking ring, a heavy metallic thud followed by a shockwave that rattled the corridor panels. Observers expected to see a human body flung backward, bones shattered. Instead, Marcus wrapped both arms around the container's edges. His boots slammed against the docking floor. The deck plating dented beneath the sudden load transfer. His knees buckled, but did not collapse. He stopped it. Not gently, not without strain. Surveillance audio captured a sharp exhalation as the force transmitted through his frame. But the container's forward momentum bled into his brace stance and died there. 400 kilograms of mass, still carrying lethal inertia, had met a biological structure evolved under one standard gravity. He lowered the crate to the deck. One Velcrin technician fainted. Another staggered backward, staring at the human as if witnessing a myth materialize. Emergency responders arrived seconds later, expecting casualties. Instead, they found Marcus flexing his hands and asking whether anyone was hurt. The footage spread before the incident report was even finalized. Council members watched in silence as the recording looped in the emergency chamber. They slowed it frame by frame. The physics calculations were undeniable. At 0.35 g, lifting a static object of that mass might be possible for certain reinforced species. But intercepting it mid-momentum, absorbing and counteracting its kinetic energy, was another matter entirely. Pause at impact, Professor Kareth instructed. The frame froze, human body angled against the container, muscles visibly engaged beneath fabric, deck plating warped under transferred force. Data overlays reconstructed the vector exchange. Under Council standard gravity, that collision would have crushed a Velcrin thoracic plate, she murmured. Under 1G, he would have had less rebound displacement. His evolutionary baseline trained him to resist greater compressive force. In 0.35G, another analyst added, he was operating with excess capacity. The chancellor leaned forward slightly. In other words, the lower gravity did not weaken him. It advantaged him. Yes, Kareth answered. His musculoskeletal system is calibrated for higher constant load. In reduced gravity environments, humans are effectively unburdened. The phrase lingered in the chamber. Unburdened. Council security officials began recalculating quietly in adjacent data streams. What did this mean for industrial sectors? For disaster response? For military projection? Most species required adaptation suits to function in environments outside narrow gravitational ranges. Humans required nothing. In most council habitats, they would move faster, lift more, react quicker. The political implications began to crystallize. Ambassador Hayes was summoned again, this time not for testing, but for explanation. He arrived with the same composed posture as before. When the footage played behind him, he watched it with a faint crease of concern. Marcus is fine? He asked first. He sustained minor muscular strain, the chancellor replied. He refused medical leave. Hayes allowed himself a small exhale. That sounds like him. You consider this normal? Professor Kareth pressed. Hayes considered his words. Under our gravity, catching something that heavy mid-fall would have been dangerous. He might have broken a wrist. But in 0.35G, the mass is the same. Yes, but the effective load is lower. Our bodies are built to manage higher sustained stress. Lower gravity environments reduce our baseline strain. You make it sound trivial, the chancellor said. Hayes shook his head slightly. Not trivial, just physics. The chamber absorbed that answer. Physics. For millennia, physics had dictated the outer boundaries of life. Gravity above 0.9 standard meant collapse. Infrastructure stress. Biological decay. The council had internalized that as immutable truth. But the footage from Heliox 9 suggested something far more unsettling. Humans were not constrained by the same boundary conditions. In most galactic environments, gravity was a limiter. For humans, it was a release. Professor Kareth accessed the projection once more. If this individual is not exceptional, he isn't, Hayes confirmed quietly. We have millions stronger. Silence deepened. Somewhere within council strategy divisions, simulations were already running. Human dockworkers lifting collapsed hull plating during station breaches. Human responders operating without exosuits in high-pressure environments. Human soldiers, if ever required, moving through low-gravity battlefields with terrifying efficiency. The chancellor closed the projection at last. The galaxy banned 1G worlds because they crushed civilizations, she said softly. Hayes met her gaze. For you, that distinction hung heavier than gravity itself. Because if 1G did not crush humanity, if it refined them, then the council was no longer evaluating a fragile newcomer species. They were confronting something shaped by pressure and strengthened by it. The council did not sleep that cycle. Archival access requests flooded the central data core at a volume not seen since the border wars. When science fails, history is consulted, and when history trembles, secrets surface. Deep beneath the public records of the Galactic Council lay a sealed archive labeled with a designation most current representatives had only heard whispered in academic rumor, the Kirill Initiative. Authorization required unanimous executive consent. For the first time in 4,000 cycles, that consent was granted. The chamber lights dimmed as the ancient files decrypted. What emerged was not simply data, it was shame. Long before the Council solidified its authority, before standardized gravity units and interstellar treaties, there had been ambition. The Kirill, a technologically advanced species of the inner spiral arm, had discovered a cluster of high-mass planets orbiting a stable yellow star. Their gravity readings range between 0.95 and 1.1 standard. At the time, no formal prohibition existed. The Kirill were bold, industrially sophisticated, and confident in their adaptive medicine. They believed that with exoskeletal reinforcement and metabolic enhancers, they could establish a foothold on what they called high-yield worlds. The Council in formation had warned caution. The Kirill called it fear. The first colony report had been optimistic. Structural foundations were stable. Artificial gravity compensators reduced perceived load indoors. But the problems began immediately outside the domes. Colonists required assistance to traverse open terrain. Cardiovascular strain became chronic. Fracture rates increased exponentially within months. Reproductive viability declined. Offspring born under 1G conditions exhibited severe skeletal deformities and organ stress. The Chiral adapted again, more implants, more pharmacological support, but gravity did not negotiate. The archive displayed footage rarely shown beyond classified circles. Colonists attempting to stand without support braces, infrastructure buckling under miscalculated stress tolerances, medical wards overflowing with patients whose bodies were simply not built for the load. Within 2 cycles, abandonment was ordered. Evacuation ships carried back survivors whose bone density had permanently degraded. The Chiral civilization never fully recovered. Population decline accelerated. Within a millennium, they were extinct, not solely from gravity, but from the cascading economic and biological collapse it triggered. Evolutionary wall. Professor Kareth murmured as the final images faded. They struck it and broke. The Chiral were not alone. 2 subsequent species attempted limited settlement experiments on similar worlds. Both suffered catastrophic failure. The Council responded with policy. Gravity above 0.9 standard was classified as biologically prohibitive. It was not cowardice, they told themselves. It was stewardship. Entire star clusters were redlined from expansion charts. Young civilizations were taught early. Some thresholds are not meant to be crossed. The Chancellor folded her hands slowly. We did not flee those worlds, she said. We survived them by learning restraint. And now, another delegate whispered, a species evolved there without restraint. The chamber shifted to comparative data. Earth's gravity, 1.0 standard. Human fossil records indicated no artificial intervention in early development. Their evolutionary timelines spanned millions of years under constant compressive load. Unlike the Chiral, who attempted to adapt technologically in decades, humans had been shaped biologically over geological time. Bone density increased generation by generation. Cardiovascular systems strengthened. Muscular endurance improved. They were not visitors to high gravity. They were products of it. Note atmospheric variance, an archivist added. Earth also experiences tectonic instability, extreme weather patterns, and significant temperature gradients. The projection shifted to images of hurricanes spiraling across oceans, volcanic eruptions reshaping landscapes, glaciers advancing and retreating. The Council had categorized 1G worlds as lethal primarily due to gravitational strain. Earth compounded that strain with chaos. They did not evolve under idealized laboratory conditions, Professor Kareth said softly. They evolved under pressure. Continuous, unpredictable pressure. The Chancellor's gaze drifted toward Ambassador Hayes, who stood at the periphery of the chamber, observing without interruption. Did your species ever attempt to abandon Earth due to gravity? She asked. Hayes considered the question carefully. No, Chancellor. We tried to conquer it. Early in our history, we struggled with disease, famine, environmental disasters. But gravity wasn't something we debated. It was simply there, like the sky. That acceptance, Kareth said quietly, is the difference. The Chiral approached 1G as an obstacle to overcome temporarily. Humans approached it as baseline reality. Their physiology did not collapse because it never operated below that threshold. Their bones calcified under its demand. Their hearts grew strong because they had to pump against it every second of their existence. Evolution did not negotiate with gravity. It selected for those who could endure it. The council chamber fell into contemplative silence. For millennia, the prohibition against 1G worlds had been treated as wisdom earned through tragedy. Entire sectors of space remained unexplored not because of lack of resources, but because of inherited caution. The red zones on council maps were monuments to past failure. But if humanity existed, thrived, on such a world, then those red zones were not universal truths. They were species-specific limitations. The political implications sharpened like a blade. Hundreds of high-mass planets, previously deemed biologically unreachable, suddenly represented viable expansion territory for one species. Trade routes could be redefined. Strategic choke points reconsidered. Economic projections recalculated. Gravity did not eliminate them, the Chancellor said finally. It refined them. Hayes gave a small nod. It taught us efficiency. Efficiency, one delegate echoed incredulously. When every movement costs more energy, Hayes explained calmly, you learn not to waste it. That statement lingered longer than expected. The Council had interpreted the chiral collapse as proof that certain boundaries were absolute. Humanity reframed that boundary as environmental context. The evolutionary wall had not been a universal barrier. It had been a filter, and somewhere in the distant Sol system, life had passed through it. Professor Kareth accessed the final archival entry, a council decree written after the chiral extinction. It read, let no species again risk annihilation by attempting to dwell where gravity exceeds the tolerance of sapient life. She read it aloud. Then she looked at the human ambassador standing under 0.6 G station conditions as comfortably as if he were strolling through a garden. Perhaps, she said slowly, we misdefined tolerance. The chamber lights brightened incrementally, illuminating delegates whose worldview had subtly shifted. Gravity was no longer merely a hazard to avoid. It was an evolutionary crucible, and humanity had been forged inside it. It was inevitable that the military analysts would run the numbers. Science had confirmed the biology. History had revealed the context. Now strategy demanded its turn. While the public council chambers debated ethics and diplomacy, a quieter meeting convened within the Strategic Defense Directorate, an angular chamber of reinforced alloy where conversations were measured not in ideals, but in probabilities. The screens lining the walls displayed nothing organic or philosophical. They displayed simulations. At the center of the primary projection hovered a human figure model, 1.78 meters tall, average muscle mass. Baseline civilian metrics pulled from the voluntary testing database Ambassador Hayes had provided. No elite augmentation. No special training modifiers. Simply human median. Around the figure, environmental parameters adjusted in rapid succession. Run Scenario 1, Director Varick ordered. Gravity, 0.4 standard. Atmospheric density, Council normal. Terrain, urban combat zone. The model moved. Even before velocity overlays activated, the advantage was obvious. Stride length increased by 42%. Vertical displacement nearly doubled. Reaction timing, measured in neural latency simulations, shortened due to reduced gravitational resistance on limb acceleration. When the model engaged in simulated physical confrontation against a Velcrin combatant in standard gear, the outcome metrics displayed in stark clarity. 78% probability of human dominance in close-quarters engagement. Adjust for trained human, Varick said. The percentages climbed. Run Scenario 2. Gravity, 0.2 standard. Terrain, asteroid colony interior. Structural hazards present. Under reduced gravity, most council species required stabilizing harnesses to prevent overcorrection during movement. The human model, by contrast, displayed enhanced mobility with minimal coordination loss. Muscular overcompensation remained within controllable thresholds. When forced into heavy lift rescue operations, debris removal, collapsed structural beams, the human median output exceeded Krytoian labor class projections by a factor of 2. Scenario 3. Varick continued, voice quieter now. Gravity, 0.9 standard. Harsh atmospheric variance. Prolonged deployment simulation. Here, the human did not display superhuman expansion of capability. Instead, something subtler emerged, stability. Where other species' stamina indicators dipped toward fatigue zones, the human baseline remained consistent. Cardiovascular stress elevated within expected ranges, but did not spike into failure territory. The model simply endured. Conclusion? Varick asked. A junior strategist swallowed before answering. In most council operating environments, humans function at reduced baseline strain. Their evolutionary calibration to one standard gravity creates surplus output capacity in lower gravity theaters. They are not merely compatible with council zones. They are advantaged within them. Silence followed. No one in the chamber needed to articulate what that meant. The council had long maintained equilibrium through mutual limitation. Species were strong in different contexts, weak in others. Environmental specialization balanced power distribution. But humans introduced asymmetry. In nearly every known council standard gravity environment, zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.7 standard. They would operate below evolutionary stress thresholds. Faster, stronger, harder to exhaust. And at 1G? Another analyst asked. Varric nodded toward the screen. The model recalibrated to Earth normal conditions. Performance normalized. No dramatic advantages. No catastrophic strain. Simply equilibrium. In their native gravity, the analyst murmured, they are at baseline. Everywhere else, they are operating with mechanical relief. Like removing weighted armor, someone added quietly. Exactly. The directorate expanded the simulation parameters beyond infantry metrics. Disaster response scenarios. Mining operations in high-mass asteroid fields. Boarding maneuvers during orbital instability. In each case, the human baseline demonstrated either enhanced capacity or stable endurance compared to Council medians. Now simulate adversarial posture, Varric ordered. The room stiffened. Human model, trained variant. Council composite defense force, standard mixed unit. The engagement unfolded in accelerated time. Tactical unpredictability variables were added based on known human historical patterns, risk tolerance under pressure, adaptive improvisation, aggressive countermaneuvering when outnumbered. The model did not always win, but it rarely collapsed. Even under unfavorable conditions, it maintained cohesion. Psychological resilience factors? Varric asked. Preliminary data indicates elevated persistence under stress, the analyst replied. High adrenal response, significant pain tolerance, continued function under moderate injury. The footage from Heliox 9 flickered briefly in a corner of the screen as reference. Director Varric leaned back slowly. The Council banned 1G worlds because they produced biological failure, he said. We assumed such gravity environments were evolutionary dead ends. But for humans, the junior strategist finished quietly. It was selective pressure. A new projection filled the central display, a map of previously redlined high-mass planetary systems. Hundreds of them. Worlds abandoned in doctrine, untouched in exploration. If humans choose to expand into those zones, Varric said carefully, no Council species can follow without artificial support. The asymmetry deepened. A Krytoian commander spoke for the first time. Are we discussing alliance, he rumbled, or containment? No one answered immediately. The political wing of the Council was still debating whether humans represented a scientific curiosity or a diplomatic opportunity. But here, in the quiet logic of strategic modeling, a more pragmatic question had formed. If gravity refined humans rather than destroying them, what else had Earth refined? Run long-term projection, Varric ordered. Timeline, 1 century. Human expansion into 1G and above systems. Industrial development. Military maturation consistent with historical growth rates. The model's result did not show conquest. It showed influence. Trade routes restructured around high-mass systems only humans could inhabit comfortably. Infrastructure networks anchored in gravitational zones inaccessible to others. Economic leverage born not from aggression, but from compatibility. They would not need to dominate, the analyst whispered. No, Varric agreed. They would simply occupy what we cannot. The realization was almost more destabilizing than outright military threat. Humanity's advantage was environmental, structural, passive but profound. A message alert blinked at the edge of the display, notification from the political chamber. A faction within the Council had begun arguing for immediate recruitment of human industrial and defense cooperation. Another faction was calling for strict expansion limits. Director Varric exhaled slowly. We feared gravity, he said. They adapted to it. On the screen, the human model stood at 1.0 standard gravity. Unremarkable, stable, ordinary. But when the environment shifted lower, the figure moved with startling efficiency. The implication was inescapable. The galaxy had structured itself around the limits of its own physiology. Humanity had grown up beyond that limit. And now every strategic equation would have to account for a species that did not merely survive 1 standard gravity, but had been shaped by it. The Galactic Council had weathered wars, famines, border disputes, and ideological schisms across millennia, but rarely had it fractured over something as intangible and as destabilizing as gravity. The debate began in measured tones, cloaked in diplomacy and procedural restraint. Within 2 cycles, it had evolved into open ideological division. The chamber that once echoed with scientific astonishment now vibrated with political tension. Humanity's existence had not introduced an enemy. It had introduced a question the Council had never needed to ask. What happens when a species is not bound by the same environmental ceilings as everyone else? The isolationist bloc moved first. Led by the Velcrin consulate, they argued from historical trauma. The Kuril catastrophe was not ancient myth, it was ancestral memory. We established prohibition for a reason, Consul Draven declared. His harness supports humming faintly as he leaned forward. One standard gravity represents systemic biological risk. A species evolved within it may not perceive the danger, but their expansion into previously quarantined zones destabilizes the equilibrium of galactic settlement. His meaning was clear. If humans colonized 1G systems, they would possess territory inaccessible to others. Territory was power. Across the chamber, the militarist faction countered. Director Varric himself stood to address the assembly. Equilibrium is already destabilized, he said bluntly. Humans are not hypothetical. They exist. They operate efficiently in our environments and natively in zones we cannot access. The rational response is integration, not exclusion. Cooperative defense doctrine with human participation strengthens us all. His argument carried strategic weight, but it also acknowledged something the isolationists feared. Once integrated, humans would inevitably hold leverage. The scientists, led by Professor Kareth, attempted neutrality. This is not solely a political matter, she insisted. Our biological models are incomplete. Humans represent evolutionary variants beyond our current frameworks. To restrict them out of fear is intellectually dishonest. Yet even among researchers, quiet fascination blended with unease. Every new dataset from Earth rewrote assumptions about skeletal thresholds, metabolic endurance, and stress adaptation. The diplomatic bloc occupied the narrowing center ground. Ambassadorial delegates from mid-tier species urged caution without hostility. Humans have shown no aggression, one Brenti representative reminded the chamber. Their ambassador has cooperated transparently. Their civilian rescued Velcrin technicians at personal risk. We are debating containment of a species that has not threatened us. And yet, Consul Draven replied sharply, potential is threat. All eyes drifted, again, to Ambassador Hayes. He had been present for every session since Earth's gravity reading first illuminated the chamber. He listened more than he spoke. When addressed directly, he answered without evasion. When accused indirectly, he did not react defensively. Now, as the debate intensified, the Chancellor invited him forward. Ambassador Hayes, she said carefully, the Council requires clarity. Does humanity intend to colonize high-mass systems currently designated as prohibited zones? Hayes did not hesitate. Yes. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a wave of overlapping voices. He raised a hand slightly, not commanding silence, merely requesting space to finish. We are not seeking territorial dominance, he continued. But our population is expanding. Our industries require resources. Many of the systems you have marked prohibited are habitable by our standards. It would be illogical not to explore them. Exploration is not the concern, Draven interjected. Exclusivity is. If only your species can inhabit those systems naturally, you gain uncontested strategic advantage. Hayes inclined his head. Only if we choose to weaponize it. The directness unsettled them. Would you? Varric asked, not accusatory, curious. Hayes met his gaze. Our history includes conflict, yes, but it also includes cooperation. Earth has learned difficult lessons about competition over resources. Expansion does not require conquest. Intent changes, Draven pressed. Governments shift. Alliances fracture. True, Hayes agreed. That is why transparency matters. The diplomatic bloc seized on that word. Define transparency, one delegate prompted. We propose joint observation missions, Hayes replied. Multi-species scientific outposts on high-mass worlds. Shared research facilities. Trade corridors. We are not asking you to follow us into 1G territory. We are asking you not to forbid us from inhabiting what we are built for. The Chancellor observed him closely. There was no boast in his posture. No triumph. Just an almost quiet insistence that gravity was not a moral issue. It was environmental context. Professor Kareth activated a projection behind him, a map of redline systems slowly overlaid with demographic modeling. If humans colonize even 20% of previously prohibited systems, she said, their economic influence increases by 40% within 5 decades. That is not aggression. That is simple arithmetic. Arithmetic. The word carried more weight than rhetoric. The chamber grew still again, not with shock, but with recognition. The fracture line was no longer about fear of collapse. It was about balance. For millennia, the Council had existed within mutually shared limitations. Humanity disrupted that symmetry not through force, but through compatibility with environments others could not endure. Consul Dravan's voice softened slightly. "You ask us not to fear gravity," he said to Hayes. "But we do not fear gravity. We fear imbalance." Hayes paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then perhaps the imbalance is not in our expansion," he said, "but in your assumptions." A ripple passed through the chamber, part irritation, part reluctant acknowledgement. "Explain," the Chancellor requested. "You defined 1G worlds as evolutionary walls," Hayes said. "But walls are species-specific. We are not asking to redefine your limits. Only ours." The diplomatic bloc murmured agreement. The militarists calculated quietly. The isolationists remained unconvinced, but less certain than before. For the first time since the gravity revelation, the debate shifted away from biological impossibility and toward philosophical adaptation. Humanity was not attempting to change the galaxy's gravitational standards. They were simply refusing to inherit its fears. And as the Council recessed into private deliberation chambers, one reality crystallized across factions alike. The ban on 1G worlds had preserved civilizations once. Now it might restrict them, because beyond the red lines on ancient maps lay hundreds of systems waiting, not for conquest, but for a species that called one standard gravity home. The fracture within the Council might have deepened into permanent division if not for the incident on Carthos 9. Unlike Earth, Carthos 9 was not a full 1.0 standard world. It hovered at 0.92, just below the old prohibition line, high enough to strain most Council species, low enough to justify limited industrial presence under heavy reinforcement protocols. The planet was rich in dense mineral veins used in starship hull fabrication, which made it economically valuable despite the physical cost of operating there. Krytoian miners dominated the labor force, their high-gravity evolutionary background granting them partial tolerance, though even they required structural braces and strict rotation schedules. It was considered a difficult world, but manageable, until the collapse. A tectonic fault shifted beneath mining sector Delta, triggering a cascade failure in 3 subterranean support tunnels. Reinforced beams buckled. Entire sections of excavation corridors collapsed under sudden gravitational redistribution. Emergency alarms activated planet-wide. Automated stabilizers failed. Within minutes, over 200 miners were trapped beneath thousands of tons of compacted rock and structural debris. Rescue teams mobilized immediately, but reality set in fast. At 0.92 G, most Council species operated near their upper strain threshold. Lifting debris required powered exosuits. But the collapse had damaged power lines and auxiliary systems. Several exosuits shorted under pressure stress. The Krytoian rescue supervisors calculated grimly. Even if structural support could be re-established, extraction would take too long. Air quality below ground was degrading rapidly. Survival probability dropped by the hour. The Council received the distress call in the middle of an already tense session on human expansion policy. Director Varric was the first to speak. "We have a human delegation present in orbit," he said quietly. All eyes shifted. Ambassador Hayes did not wait for formal invitation. "How deep are they?" he asked. 40 meters below surface in primary collapse zone, Professor Kareth replied, pulling up a geological cross-section. "Debris density high. Structural instability ongoing. We cannot safely deploy heavy machinery." "How long before oxygen depletion?" Hayes pressed. "Estimated 12 hours. Hayes turned toward the Chancellor. "We can help." The chamber hesitated. Isolationist Consul Dravan stiffened. "This is not a proving ground," he warned. "We will not risk interspecies diplomatic fallout if your civilians are injured." "They are already at risk," Hayes replied calmly. We have engineers in orbit capable of high-gravity operations. At 0.92 g, this is close to Earth normal conditions for us. We do not require exosuits. The militarist faction murmured approval. The diplomatic bloc exchanged uneasy glances. The scientists leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. The chancellor made the decision. Authorize joint rescue, she ordered. Human volunteers operate under Krytoian command. Within 2 hours, 3 human engineers descended through Carthos 9's dense atmosphere aboard reinforced dropcraft. No powered exoskeletons. No gravitic assist rigs. They wore standard atmospheric suits and carried compact hydraulic tools. Council observers monitored from orbit, feeds transmitted live to the central chamber. The surface gravity registered 0.92 standard. The humans stepped onto the platform and adjusted their footing, barely. Krytoian supervisors directed them toward the collapsed shaft entrance. The debris field was immense. Layered rock, twisted alloy beams, fractured tunnel supports compressed by near-Earth gravity. Krytoian rescuers struggled to shift even smaller fragments without mechanical assistance. Human engineer Ibarra, recognizable from the Heliox 9 incident, examined the debris pattern quickly. Load distribution's uneven, he said, voice steady over comms. We need to relieve lateral pressure before vertical lift. Structural stress risk, a Krytoian supervisor warned. If you miscalculate, then we don't miscalculate, Ibarra replied. He wedged a hydraulic jack beneath a warped beam and braced himself. Another human anchored the opposite side manually, muscles visibly engaged under suit fabric. They lifted in coordinated motion. The beam shifted, not dramatically, but enough to redistribute load. A third human slid into the newly opened gap and began clearing rock fragments by hand. At 92 centimos. Krytoian observers froze momentarily before joining the effort. Without waiting for heavy machinery recalibration, the rescue team moved piece by piece. Human endurance under near-baseline gravity allowed sustained exertion without collapse. Where Krytoian operators rotated every 15 minutes due to strain fatigue, the humans worked nearly 40 before hydration breaks. Inside the chamber, council delegates watched in silence. They are not operating beyond their limit, Professor Kareth murmured. They are operating at baseline. Below ground, a trapped miner's faint tapping was detected. Ibarra shifted position immediately, crawling through a narrow gap that would have required exoskeletal compression suits for others. He wedged his shoulders beneath a slab and lifted incrementally while Krytoians reinforced the shift with braces. Got him, Ibarra breathed. The first miner emerged 3 hours into the operation. Then another, and another. The rescue continued through rotational shifts. Human engineers rotated with Krytoian crews seamlessly. When one hydraulic tool failed, a human improvised leverage using a reinforced beam and bodyweight counterbalance. Structural debris that required multiple Krytoian braces under standard conditions shifted under combined human muscle redistribution. After 9 hours, the final trapped miner was extracted. 217 survivors. 0 fatalities. The chamber remained silent long after the transmission ended. The data was clear. At 0.92 g, just below the old prohibition threshold, humans functioned not as anomalies, but as stabilizers. They were not dominating the environment. They were simply compatible with it. Consul Draven spoke first, his voice lower than usual. They did not exploit advantage, he admitted. They assisted. The Chancellor nodded slowly. Gravity did not grant them cruelty, she said. It granted them resilience. Ambassador Hayes stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back. We are not here to conquer high-mass worlds, he said softly. We grew up under them. The rescue at Carthos 9 did not erase political fear. It did not dissolve strategic concerns, but it shifted the axis of perception. Humans were no longer just the species that survived 1G. They were the species that could walk into near-prohibitive gravity and lift others out. And in that moment, the Council's debate transformed from whether humanity should be contained to whether they might be indispensable. The rescue at Carthos 9 changed the tone of the Council, but it did not settle the question of expansion. If anything, it sharpened it. Public sentiment across multiple member systems shifted in humanity's favor. Broadcast footage of human engineers hauling miners from near-collapse gravity circulated widely. Commentators who had once labeled humans biological aberrations now called them structural assets. Yet in private chambers, the deeper concern remained untouched. Assistance was one thing. Sovereignty was another. It was 4 cycles after the Carthos 9 rescue when Ambassador Hayes submitted the formal document. The notification chimed across the Council's internal network with understated simplicity. Petition for Colonization Authorization, System, H.R. 1173. Planetary Gravity, 1.08 Standard. Proposed Classification, Human Adapted Settlement Zone. The chamber fell into immediate procedural lockdown. H.R. 1173 had been redlined since its discovery. At 1.08 g, it exceeded even Earth's baseline gravity. The archives categorized it as severely prohibitive. No serious settlement proposals had ever been considered. Even robotic exploration required reinforced chassis, and humanity had just requested colonization rights. Is this a symbolic gesture? Consul Dravan demanded the moment Hayes stepped forward. No, Hayes replied calmly. It is demographic necessity. Professor Kareth pulled up the planetary profile. H.R. 1173 was mineral-rich, geologically stable compared to Earth, with moderate climate bands and substantial freshwater reserves. Its primary deterrent was gravitational load. Atmospheric density was within breathable conversion parameters. Radiation levels were low. By most metrics, aside from gravity, it was ideal. 1.08 standard is above your homeworld baseline, Kareth observed. Yes, Hayes acknowledged, but within tolerable margin. Our physiologists estimate adaptation through conditioning and selective infrastructure planning. We are not proposing immediate mass migration. We are proposing phased colonization. You would intentionally move your population to a higher gravitational load than your evolutionary baseline. Draven pressed, incredulous. Hayes gave a faint smile. We climb mountains for recreation. The statement was not arrogance. It was pattern. Director Varick interjected. What infrastructure do you intend to deploy? Reinforced load-bearing architecture. Distributed vertical zoning to minimize repetitive ascent strain. Rotational work scheduling during early adaptation phases. Long-term generational acclimatization studies. The council chamber quieted again. Generational. Humans were not discussing short-term occupation. They were planning for evolution under increased gravity. Professor Kareth's voice carried both awe and caution. You believe your species can adapt further? We believe stress refines biology, Hayes answered simply. The isolationist bloc recoiled at that phrasing. You are treating gravity as opportunity, Draven said. Hayes met his gaze steadily. It always was. The economic projections displayed behind the Chancellor updated in real time. If humans established a foothold on H.R. 1173, they would gain exclusive access to dense core minerals currently untapped by any council member. Trade leverage would follow. Strategic positioning would follow. Not through aggression, but through occupancy. The diplomatic bloc proposed compromise. Joint oversight, a Brenti delegate suggested. Council observers embedded within the colony. Shared research access. Transparent development milestones. Hayes nodded without hesitation. Agreed. The speed of that agreement shifted the atmosphere subtly. Humanity was not demanding autonomy beyond oversight. They were inviting scrutiny. Why? Dravan asked bluntly. Why expose your expansion to our monitoring? Hayes paused before answering. Because we understand your fear, he said. You believe high-gravity zones create asymmetry. If we operate in isolation, suspicion grows. If we operate transparently, perhaps trust grows instead. Trust. A fragile word in a chamber built on precedent and caution. The Chancellor studied the human ambassador carefully. There was no visible strain in his posture. No eagerness that suggested conquest. Only steady insistence that gravity was not a moral dividing line. It was environmental context. H.R. 1173 exceeds Earth gravity by 8%, Kareth reiterated. Your long-term skeletal integrity may be affected. Yes, Hayes agreed. And we will study that. Carefully. You risk permanent physiological alteration. All species evolve, Hayes replied softly. We just happen to evolve under heavier skies. The chamber absorbed that phrase. Heavier skies. For millennia. The Council had treated 1G worlds as ceilings. Humans treated them as starting points. The vote did not occur that cycle. Procedural review required simulation modeling, economic assessment, and legal arbitration. But the psychological shift was undeniable. Humanity was no longer defending its existence under 1G. It was extending the boundary. Outside the chamber, news of the petition spread quickly across council systems. Commentators debated ethics, risk, and precedent. Younger species expressed curiosity. Older ones expressed apprehension. But among industrial sectors and frontier exploration guilds, a different reaction surfaced: opportunity. If humans could inhabit HR 1173 successfully, hundreds of similar systems might follow. The red zones on ancient maps would begin to change color, not erased, but reclassified. Inside the chamber, the Chancellor adjourned the session with measured gravity. This petition is not merely about one planet, she said. It is about whether limitation defines us. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Hayes. For millennia, we believed gravity set the outer boundary of sapient life. Humanity suggests otherwise. As the chamber lights dimmed, the holographic projection of HR 1173 rotated slowly above them. A dense, massive world long marked as unreachable. Now it was simply waiting. And for the first time in council history, a species had not asked whether it was safe to live there. They had asked when they could begin. The vote on HR 1173 stalled, not because the council lacked data, but because it lacked certainty. Economic models projected advantage. Biological projections suggested survivability with calculated risk. Political factions remained split. So humanity did something unexpected. They extended an invitation, not to a negotiation table, to Earth. The official communiqué was simple: multi-species observation delegation, seasonal event study. Location: Earth, Northern Hemisphere. The timing was deliberate. Earth was entering what humans casually referred to as storm season. Several council delegates privately assumed this was a symbolic gesture, an attempt to humanize their species, to showcase culture, art, perhaps urban sophistication under 1G. What they received instead was something far more destabilizing. The delegation's orbital shuttle descended through thick atmospheric turbulence. Even within reinforced transport fields, the vessel shuddered as it pierced layers of unstable air currents. Lightning fractured the clouds in branching arcs. Winds exceeding safe council thresholds battered the hull. "Is this a military display?" one Brenty observer asked tightly. Ambassador Hayes, seated calmly across from them, shook his head. "Tuesday," he replied. They landed near a coastal observation facility specifically prepared for alien physiology. Outside the reinforced transparasteel walls, the ocean heaved violently under hurricane-force winds. Waves the height of council docking spires crashed against breakwaters. Rain struck in sheets so dense it blurred the horizon into gray chaos. "This storm system has been classified Category 4, a human meteorologist explained to the delegation. Wind speeds sustained at over 200 kilometers per hour. Expected landfall in approximately 40 minutes. Several delegates turned sharply toward Hayes. "You evacuated the population?" Consul Draven demanded. "From low-lying areas, yes," Hayes answered. "But the city inland remains active. Infrastructure is built to withstand it." The storm made landfall. The sound was not merely loud, it was primal. Wind screamed against reinforced structures. Debris lifted and spiraled through the air. Power lines flexed, but did not snap. Buildings swayed slightly under stress calculations that had been engineered with brutal familiarity. The council delegation watched in stunned silence as humans moved within the facility calmly. Emergency crews staged equipment. Communication networks rerouted automatically. No panic. No collapse. "How frequently does this occur?" Professor Kareth asked quietly. "Seasonally," the meteorologist replied. The storm intensified for nearly 3 hours before gradually losing structure inland. When it passed, the delegation expected devastation akin to the Chiral archives: collapse, biological strain, systemic breakdown. Instead, they saw something different. Damage, yes. Flooded streets. Uprooted trees. Structural strain. But repair crews mobilized immediately. Heavy machinery moved through debris fields. Human responders lifted fractured support beams without powered assistance. Civilians assisted neighbors. Power grids restored within hours. Gravity is not Earth's only stressor, Hayes said softly as they observed the aftermath. We also contend with tectonic shifts. As if summoned by narrative timing, seismic sensors registered minor tremors. The observation screens shifted to live footage from another continent, a controlled evacuation during a magnitude 6 earthquake. Buildings designed with flexible reinforcement absorbed shock. Emergency drills executed with procedural precision. And volcanic activity? Kareth asked. Hayes nodded toward a separate feed showing controlled exclusion zones near an active volcano. Monitored constantly. The realization settled slowly, like weight. Earth did not merely operate under one standard gravity. It operated under relentless environmental volatility layered on top of that gravity. Windstorms, earthquakes, floods, temperature extremes, seasonal variability, all compounding physical strain. You evolved under this? Draven asked, not accusing now, processing. Yes, Hayes answered simply. Your species did not collapse? We did, Hayes corrected gently. Many times. Civilizations fell. Infrastructure failed. We rebuilt. Repeatedly. The distinction mattered. Humans had not survived because Earth was stable. They had survived because it wasn't. As the delegation toured coastal reconstruction zones the following day, they observed something even more unsettling than physical resilience: psychological normalization. Children played in puddles left by floodwaters. Street vendors reopened stalls. Construction cranes rotated methodically against still gray skies. You do not fear recurrence? One delegate asked a human engineer repairing a damaged seawall. The engineer shrugged lightly. It'll happen again next year. That's why we designed for it. Designed for it. The phrase echoed uncomfortably within council minds. For millennia, the council had treated environmental extremes as conditions to avoid. Humans treated them as design parameters. Later, as the delegation prepared to depart Earth orbit, Professor Kareth accessed comparative planetary data once more. HR 1173's gravity reading hovered at 1.08 standard. Its tectonic instability index was lower than Earth's. Its storm frequency moderate. By objective environmental metrics, she murmured to the Chancellor privately, HR 1173 is less volatile than Earth, aside from gravity. The Chancellor remained silent for a long moment. Outside the viewport, Earth rotated below them. Blue oceans calm once more, storm system dissipating into scattered cloud formations. From orbit, it appeared serene. Deceptively so. They were not shaped by gravity alone. The Chancellor said at last. They were shaped by chaos. And gravity ensured only the strongest adaptations persisted, Kareth added. As the shuttle engaged FDL returned toward Council space, a new understanding crystallized among the delegation. The ban on 1G worlds had been rooted in fear of structural collapse. But Earth demonstrated something more profound. Stress does not merely break civilizations. Sometimes it forges them. And if humanity could normalize hurricanes, earthquakes, and one standard gravity as background conditions of existence, then HR 1173 was not an escalation. It was simply the next storm. And humans, as history repeatedly showed, did not flee storms. They built within them. The final vote did not feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no last-minute revelations, no theatrical declarations of unity or defiance. Instead, there was a quiet gravity to the chamber, heavier than one standard, some would later say. The delegates had seen Earth. They had studied the biology. They had run the simulations, analyzed the rescue metrics, and revisited the Kirill tragedy with fresh perspective. The question before them was no longer whether humans could survive high-mass worlds. The question was whether the galaxy would redefine its limits because of them. The holographic projection of HR 1173 rotated slowly above the chamber floor. Dense, mineral-rich, patient. For 4,000 cycles, it had been a red mark on navigational charts, an environmental warning wrapped in doctrine. Now it was a test of philosophical evolution. The Chancellor activated the vote. Isolationists cast their ballots first, measured, reluctant. Some remained opposed, citing imbalance risks and long-term uncertainty. Others shifted to conditional approval under strict oversight clauses. The militarists voted in favor almost unanimously, recognizing strategic inevitability. The scientists followed, many unable to ignore the weight of empirical data. The diplomatic bloc leaned toward structured cooperation. The final tally appeared in luminous script across the chamber. Petition approved. Conditional joint oversight. Reclassification. HR 1173 designated human-adapted settlement zone. 1G prohibition status revised. Species-specific advisory. A silence followed, not of shock, but of transition. 4,000 years of absolute doctrine had just shifted into relative understanding. The Chancellor turned toward Ambassador Hayes. The Council recognizes that gravitational tolerance is not universal, she said formally. Our prohibition remains for species whose physiology cannot endure such environments. However, humanity is granted colonization rights under cooperative observation protocols. Hayes inclined his head, neither triumphant nor humbled. We accept the terms, he replied. And just like that, the galaxy changed. Within weeks, the first human expedition fleet assembled at the edge of Council space. Not a military armada, not an act of defiance. Cargo vessels, construction modules, atmospheric processors, hydroponic infrastructure. Council observers from 6 species joined the convoy, their ships equipped with reinforced gravitic stabilizers for surface deployment. As the fleet approached HR 1173, orbital scans confirmed what long-range surveys had promised. Vast plains, stable continental masses, moderate hydrosphere distribution. Gravity reading steady at 1.08 standard. The first human landing craft descended without hesitation. Council observers monitored physiological telemetry closely. Upon touchdown, the human pioneers stepped onto the surface and paused, briefly, not from collapse, but from calibration. The additional gravitational load registered in their musculature. Their posture adjusted subtly. Breathing deepened fractionally. Then they moved. Slow at first. Measured. Testing balance. Within hours, temporary habitation modules were anchored into bedrock. Structural supports designed with Earth-based engineering principles compensated for increased load distribution. Within days, human workers operated heavy machinery without powered exosuits, though efficiency required pacing adjustments. It is heavier, one Council observer noted over comms. Yes, a human engineer replied, adjusting a reinforced beam. Feels like carrying a weighted vest. We'll adapt. The phrase rippled quietly through Council channels. We'll adapt. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a pattern. Weeks turned into months. Agricultural trials began within reinforced soil beds. Early settlers reported increased muscular fatigue during initial adjustment periods, but no catastrophic physiological failure. Human medical teams documented bone density fluctuations with fascination rather than alarm. Children born during the first colonization wave were monitored carefully, their developmental metrics recorded under joint scientific oversight. Professor Carruth spent long hours analyzing the incoming data. Early results suggested subtle increases in baseline bone density among settlers after sustained exposure. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, but the trend lines were unmistakable. Evolution does not require millennia, she murmured one evening to the Chancellor. Not when selective pressure is consistent. And this pressure, the Chancellor asked, is measurable, predictable, and survivable for them. Trade routes began shifting quietly. Mining operations on HR 1173 produced dense core alloys previously inaccessible. Human industrial exports increased, not through conquest, but through occupancy of what others had once avoided. Council species established orbital research stations, maintaining presence without surface strain. Balance did not shatter. It recalibrated. Months later, during a joint surface tour, Consul Dravan stood beside Ambassador Hayes atop a plateau overlooking the emerging human settlement. Construction cranes moved methodically against the heavier sky. Atmospheric processors hummed steadily. Human settlers walked with confident familiarity across terrain once marked prohibited. We feared gravity, Dravan admitted quietly. Hayes considered the horizon before answering. We grew up under it. Dravan studied the settlers, no longer anomalies, no longer hypothetical threats, simply a species operating within its range. The Council defined 1G as a limit, Dravan said. Hayes shook his head gently. It was never a limit, just a condition. Far above them, in orbit, Council observers transmitted the final classification update across the interstellar network. The ancient red markers on navigation charts did not disappear. They changed designation. High-mass world, human-compatible. Advisory, species-specific limitations apply. The language mattered. It acknowledged difference without declaring superiority. It preserved caution without enforcing universal fear. And across the galaxy, young species studying stellar cartography noticed something subtle but profound. The outer boundary of possibility had shifted, not because gravity changed, but because one species had never considered it impossible. On HR 1173, beneath a sky fractionally heavier than Earth's, the first permanent human settlement completed its primary structural ring. As dusk settled across the plains, artificial lights flickered on, small against the vast landscape, but steady. Gravity pressed down, as it always had. Humanity stood beneath it, and built.